here to talk a little bit about the evolution of privileged access management. So we're going to take a little bit of a history lesson today, looking back at where things started in the space, going all the way back to really the 90s. And we're going to talk through this with John Morton. So I will be your MC for today. I'm Matt Wilson, Principal Product Manager at Brightith. A quick background on myself. I've been doing product management for many years, about 7 in security-focused roles. And before that, I was a web developer, an old Perl developer from back in the day. So I'll be pulling out some of my anecdotes as well here to help put some more context around this. John, over to you.
Thanks, Matt. John Morton here, currently a field CTO bridging the gap between sales, product, and engineering as a customer evangelist. But before that, my history goes back to being an expert in physics, U.S. submarine fleet, special projects, undersea research and development. Ended up as a defender because you learn how to operate many operating systems on a submarine, and worked for the United States Postal Service, Veterans Affairs. Ended up in finance, all as a defender, operator, and then came to the vendor side. Ran the gamut of vendor side from IAM tools to IDS, IPS tools to EDR to digital rights management to everything under the sun until eventually ending up in a CPAM space and focused in the cloud. So had a good run there of different jobs, opportunities, fed, everywhere you can go. So, well, happy to be here, Matt.
Absolutely. So John and I work pretty closely together day to day, but this is going to be a fun conversation for me because unlike John, I'm actually fairly new to the identity space. So I'm here to learn as well. Before we get going, just a few quick housekeeping notes. We do have a Q&A feature, which is available throughout the webinar. John and I are going to be keeping an eye on that. If there's any questions, we'll take a look and see if it's relevant, we'll answer it right away. If not, we'll have some time at the end where we can do that. This is being recorded, so if you miss some of it and you're not able to, let's say, to be in here, we will be providing that recording early next week for everyone. And we do have some polls. So we are on our second poll now, and we would love to hear your feedback on those. It gives us a little bit of a better sense of the audience we're talking to today. So while that's up now and getting started, this is what we're going to be talking through, a little bit of a story narrative format. We'll start all the way back at the beginning, just so we understand the baseline, where some of these things came from in the privileged access space. And our goal is ultimately to talk about cloud and how things have evolved and changed and what some of the different needs are. But it's always helpful to see where, I guess, the origin story, so to speak, to know where we are today and what things are going to need to change a little bit. So with that, chapter 1, we're going to talk about these early days. So John, I was thinking about this, and being an old web developer, I know it doesn't look it, but I shaved. I have a lot of gray in this beard. I didn't have the clean face today. When I was doing a lot of this development work, late 90s, early 2000s, we were aware of security issues with you had logins, you had passwords. If you were being diligent, you hashed the passwords. It's probably MD5, which you don't use anymore. But we didn't really have this notion of securing these credentials in a system. Like, to give an example, I remember there was an application we had developed. It was for news providers, and it was on managed hosting environments. It was like $400 a month, and we would deploy your application. You got your own server. I was the one that was managing all those. We had dozens of these things, and I remember talking to our IT director, and the requirement was basically, Matt, just don't let anybody see those passwords. Write them down. And also, could you send me a password protected zip file with all of those root accounts? That's kind of our break glass, like in case, you leave the company or like something happens to you.
Yeah.
And that was just standard operating procedure, right? So I hope that sets the stage for like, how did PAM kind of evolve in these early days? How did we get from that situation to, it kind of looked like this, right?
Yeah,
user
no,
as
it's
an admin and came
pretty
along to the
accurate.
server. How did this all start?
That is pretty accurate, right? Yeah. So in the beginning, back in my day. Yeah, no, to your point, back in my day, in all reality, identity aspects, including things like um, identity management, was an operational task. It wasn't even in the beginning for a long time considered security. Like, to your point, Matt Wilson joined as a developer. I need to create an account for him, give him an email address and access to the things he needs. That was always, and even today, I would argue, for the lack of real security practitioners, an operational function. What started happening though, and this is a little bit of speculation on my point, was that giving everyone admin, somebody like a web developer like you, normally DBAs or someone like that, storage admins back in the day broke something. And they thought, okay, we're not going to let you be an admin anymore. We're going to give you a standard user account and we're going to have an admin account, right? And that's good practice, right? But I genuinely believe it did not spawn from security requirements. PAM itself, though, now that's a fun story. Because if you realize, as let's just say I'm an advanced attacker, there are admin accounts that have super functions that can turn off any security controls, reconfigure anything I want from data to resources to access. That's a target, right? And a lot of our friends in the great nation state of Israel, right? They get to develop things and build things in their military capacity, and they get to roll those things out in the public and sell them. So you start to see this evolution of ideas that revolved around admin accounts where we merge this operational idea with a security idea, and companies like CyberArk were born, right?
Okay, that's a great point. I was going to ask, so I thought I knew the answer to it. I think you've answered it. Were they really that first big player in the space, or were they really even first to market with that? Because they've been around for forever.
Yeah. So again, acknowledging some of my own lack of actual knowledge, I would say they were the founders of PAM as we know it. I'm going to say this for our listeners, right? All the requirements anybody ever sends out regarding PAM, of the most basic, and I'll call them archaic requirements, things like session recording, video session recording, session management, password rotation. I attribute those to CyberArk because at the time when they built these PAM tools to separate out admin accounts and control access in the world that they lived in 20 plus years ago, it was the right idea. Exactly. The PAM tools started to do that. And I could be wrong. There's been others throughout time, but CyberArk was the big dog. And hey, man, they did excellent work. No one's going to refute that.
So help me understand what I'm looking at a little bit here, right? So we've clearly got a separation, like you said. So I've got my regular account. I can't do much, right? I can still log into my server directly, but now you've moved my super admin permissions inside of this PAM tool. What's that virtual machine?
Yeah. Yeah, let's dig into that a little bit. So even from a compliance and risk perspective, there's always this concept of least privilege. So your account there, your regular account, should in theory be least privilege. Just don't give it admin qualifies. You can check the box. Most CISOs do that today. I'm checking the box. What happened though with tools like PAM tools, and again, CyberArk, there's others, but they're the easiest to remember. They said, well, how can we do this better? Right. And keep in mind, I'm thinking 15 years ago. They said, if we can host the actual environment, a virtual machine, where we control the ports, protocols, logins, and passwords, then we can sell this, right? That sounds aggressive, but it's a fact. Great ideas aren't great ideas unless they make money. So they started selling it. So the virtual machine, in all reality, is the portal by which someone can get access to that administrator account, which at the end of the day is a service account, a secondary account that has all those administrative privileges. But the power of the virtual machine is then being able to control, theoretically, all of the inputs. You log into the virtual machine, it is now the host by which you're executing every function and task. You can get every keystroke, you can get everything there. It is a very, very heavy lift, but it is very finely controlled.
Gotcha. Okay, so this is really putting a lot of it's accountability and visibility as well as some layer of protection around that super admin or those sort of most risky privileges, I guess you could say.
Correct. Now, keep in mind, again, and I'll just level set a little bit more. We went from the risk and compliance side of least privilege to the security side. The operations side, we don't want to forget. In the operational world, specifically in a Windows environment, Windows normally operates on a directory, Active Directory. And as an operational function, even still today, many folks are confused about this, but it's still done that at that point in time. Accounts, when they were created, how do we get this secondary super admin account? They were assigning group privileges there, right? So those group privileges or roles are statically assigned to that account, and that's what they're using in the virtual machine.
Gotcha. Okay. And so it sounds like then, so you mentioned Windows, and I did a lot of Linux back in the day, not Windows Server, which I know very little about it personally. But so looking at this, I've got to have a different account potentially with a different virtual machine for each different environment that I've got to go into. Is that accurate from what I'm looking at here?
That's 99% accurate. And that now we're starting to get to some of the shortcomings of the evolution of PAM as it existed. Think about my statement again. And again, hey, we can talk about National Security Agency all we want. Why did everything start in the Windows world? FedSpace needed some protection. Majority of the time it was Windows. Everything was built around that. We build a virtual machine, we understand Active Directory, we control logins and credentials. Then customers, consumers, once this came out, they said, well, there's other environments. There's Linux, there's databases. Again, we're still talking the on-premise world, the moated, gated, safest place ever, and they're still asking for protections. So when anybody looks at it, and if you've ever spent any time in a database, any kind, any flavor, or in a Linux environment, the identity and access management constructs are not the same, right? The Linux world is not the same as the Windows world, right? What's a PWT? What's a PWD file, right? What's that got to do with access? Well, if you live in Linux, that's everything. So respectively, if you wanted to control with this very granular and over-enforced, security measures, you have to build for the constructs of each of those. So virtual machines, again, was the way they solved the problem. If we front end it, Matt Wilson now has 3 different accounts that are managed by the PAM tool, and he has to log in to 3 different ways to communicate with the IAM construct of whatever we're trying to give him access to. What other way were they going to do it at the time when all they have is overprivileged static service accounts, right? So it's the easiest way to do it here.
Gotcha. Now, what I'm kind of curious about here too is how am I still managing these credentials for my access into things? Like, is this still, I've got my list of passwords, I just have to only use them through the PAM tool?
Yeah. Now, in theory, now we're going to get a little wax poetic here on philosophy. In theory, the value of a PAM tool to buyers, right, to end users is kind of what you said. I only have to log in once to this device. That tool, theoretically, should maintain and rotate and manage all the passwords for all the service accounts that I'm using on behalf of it, right? I'm just the user. It's giving me what I need. So that's where the PAM tool becomes extremely complex. The PAM tool's goal at this point is to make it easy for Matt to use, to log into it. And then the PAM tool, respectively, should rotate, manage, do all these overprivileged service account credential requirements. Okay.
Gotcha. So that's where kind of the vault, I'm guessing here, evolved out of it. So that's now where it's handling those credential updates, rotations. It's keeping them away from me, the dangerous, untrusted user.
Exactly. That's the theory behind it, right? Where they're saying if we vault everything in the PAM tool, now we can manage the access as far as credentials and authentication through these virtual machines to these downstream systems. Again, you still have to understand the IAM construct of everything on the left-hand side. It's a very simple model, but in theory, that's what they're trying to do. That way, theoretically, and this is best practice, right? Matt Wilson gets hit by the lottery bus. He leaves the organization. We remove him from the PAM tool. He shouldn't have access to any downstream systems. So what's the risk there? Should we spend all this time configuring this PAM tool to satisfy this requirement because we only have Matt Wilson? Sounds good to me on the surface, but in reality, there's a lot happening there.
Makes sense. Now I know too here we've now introduced kind of there's a little extra ring around the outside. I'm guessing we're highlighting this is really this is all happening on premise, right? This is servers and closets where a lot of this stuff happened, right? I'm inside the firewall. We've got that tight control from a corporate perspective.
Yeah. I like that. That's where like great companies, like if we're looking at an evolution of time, right? We're looking at an archaic world where there was nothing. Then we started getting these things and we had directories and we were trying to protect them and we're trying to do these things, right? So CyberArk came and then a few years later you're seeing right here is what I'm seeing is Palo Alto Networks with their next gen firewall was introduced to protect the crunchy outside because the inside's a little better. So exactly.
All right. Whoa. There's a lot more stuff going on here. So walk me through this. It looks like we're starting to add some complexity in here.
Yeah, buddy. So up until this point, we've been picking on just Matt Wilson. Just one example, just maybe a handful of things, couple Linux boxes, if they're even protected. I challenge anyone right now listening to this podcast to tell me if they're using their PAM tool for Linux. They're probably not because it's not easy. So we protected a handful of Windows and maybe some databases. We took some radical assumptions. What this slide is showing, though, is as a company grows in scale, and that's hopefully what happens to every company. Fed, SLED too, right? Every space, you're adding more users. And more users, user one, user two here, are examples of all the configuration that has to go into configuring all these administrative privileged accounts and the complexity you're starting to introduce where you can see just even in this tiny graph from the one to this one, an explosion of the requirements of secondary, third, fourth, fifth, tertiary accounts that are service accounts and their overprivileged access, and just how hard it is to basically manage the fundamentals of them being their credentials and all the virtual machines being deployed across all these potentially different network requirements. A Linux, if you segmented your environment appropriately, your Linux world doesn't communicate with your Windows world except through maybe one pipe. Meaning for each one of those virtual machines you're trying to deploy, the network configurations, details, and everything there are radically different than maybe in the database LAN than in the Windows LAN. And let's not get into upper and lower environments like prod, stage, and QA if you have those. And then you introduce all these users. The key to this, scaling a solution like that, although the fundamentals of it seem sound, I can lock down everything. I'm checking the box and, I'm passing audits because we're separating out the admin accounts and rotating credentials. You actually increase the problem by having to manage more service accounts, right? And it's a headache for anyone who's trying to deploy PAM because now you got to engage with the network team, explain to them how to keep these machines alive, patching, routing, all the other stuff. This is just a tiny drop in the bucket of how complex this can get if you're trying to do it in even a medium-sized environment.
That makes a lot of sense. I can see how even with just a few hundred of these, users in a company, it would probably be just a mid-sized company even, and a few hundred servers, that it's almost like you could matrix them together. You might have thousands of these combinations you'd have to manage.
Well, here's the kicker, and I'll give them credit. I'll give every PAM engineer credit. Up until the next evolution of the operating world, this was okay. Somebody had a headache. It was a lot of work. They're doing it. They're writing tickets, change requests. Getting a PAM server deployed takes 6 weeks to 6 months, but it works. A CISO's checking the box because this is still being done theoretically. Even if they don't care about security, they have the tool in place and they can check the box that we're doing it and it works. But the world does change.
I'm going to allude to this a little bit here, but if I had to guess, I would say part of this works because how often do you buy new Linux servers or new Windows servers, right? You buy them when you've fully depreciated that asset or it breaks, which is measured in years. And it's a big capital expenditure. You're probably not adding new stuff all the time. So once you get that server in there and you get it configured in the PAM tool, it's probably pretty good for a few years unless you need more users to access it.
Exactly. And if you architected your ecosystem, your operational environment to allow a minimal number of admins, keep in mind that's who we're looking at on the right by saying we've architected our applications to access this operational world in a specific way, you can keep this relatively going. It's a headache, but it'll continue to work, to your point.
So a little bit of a side thread on this here is some of this, you know, complexity or just the scale of this when you really start to build it out in a large organization. Is this what eventually led to some of the things like, you know, like the IGA tools or IAM as a discipline, right? Because if I'm thinking of this like way back in the day, first tool, PAM tool hits the market, it's not like that immediately became a job function or a department. There was
Yeah.
some evolution or growth that had to happen. Like, is that kind of what drove it?
There was, yeah. So back to the beginning, in the very beginning, I would say the construct of identity management was the key first. Identity and access management, not those who stole and mutilated those beautiful words and turned them into some sort of governance, not them. The actual operators who were managing access for identities, that was the intention. And then PAM, privileged access management, is, in my opinion, a subset of the greater identity, right? You can justify spending so much money because we only have so many users doing administrative functions. So PAM is a subset of the overall identity management ecosystem, definitively.
Great.
In this world, in this world.
In this world. John keeps saying in this world. It's like he knows what's coming next.
That's right, man. I deal with it every
Clouds
day.
on the horizon. So we're going to talk a little bit about this. And, you know, to be fair, this is not like this is an overnight transformation. This has been at this point 15, 20 years in the making for most people. And, you know, to go back to a little bit of, you know, another personal story on my side. So that same company that I was talking about where I was deploying managed stuff, right? It was just a server I could log into. The earliest notion that I had a cloud was about 2009. We had a senior architect, brilliant guy, was always playing with new bleeding edge stuff, and he started poking around with AWS, EC2 and S3 back in 2009. And I still remember he called me into his office and he wanted to show me something. And he was so proud of this thing that he had done. And he was trying to explain cloud to me. I was like, how is that different than what I've got over there? Right. Like I'm deploying stuff onto somebody else's servers. I don't know where they are. He's like, no, you don't get it, man. There's no server. Well, yeah, of course there's servers. Like, what is it running on? Right. Like, and I just couldn't wrap my brain around I guess the transitive nature that it was this abstraction on top of what we were used to. And I think
Right.
that's where a lot of people started with this. So I want to start by telling me like what are some of the earliest notions that there was something going on that was a little bit different, or especially from like this world we've been talking about, the PAM side of things, that was like,
Mhm.
huh, maybe this is a little bit square peg round hole.
Yeah, this is actually an interesting point. And I think anybody who's early on in even any journey, specifically a cloud journey, will understand this. When I first heard about it, it was similar. I was like, okay, so we're just going to move the data center somewhere else, right? Someone else is going to manage the data center for us, is what I thought the cloud meant in the beginning. And then we started getting into it and we were asking questions like, well, do we have to branch off the forest of our AD domain to give them access in this new region? And, what sort of service accounts do you need to get access into AWS? And they literally scoffed and they said, what? And I'm like, wait, how does it work then? Well, we have this thing called role assumption in AWS. We don't use accounts at all. You don't even need to have an IAM user if you can federate it back. And I'm like, hold on, what? So there's
Yeah,
this
what? Explain that a
drastic
little.
collision where I started to realize, and for me personally, my own evolution, that AWS isn't just another data center. It's offsetting an entire new way of operations. To your point, S3, EC2, RDS, all these new functions of the platform, you can think of them as like processes on an operating system. They have unique capabilities where AWS, and kudos to them, they were amazing. I'm hats off, said, that world that we had before, we want it to be faster and smarter. And what they did is they start to carve off of the heavy lifting, a lot of the heavy lifting of the IAM constructs, right? Where they're saying, let's look at things from a resource level. Let's look at things from a process level versus let's look at things from a flat directory archaic level like we had before. So even for me, that transformation was, okay, it's not just another data center. It has advanced functions and capabilities people are trying to take advantage of, especially at like a machine layer, if that makes sense.
So in that case, like you've talked about, you touched on a little bit of AWS having some of their own ways of doing these things and controlling it. Could you, I guess, just to put it bluntly, could you use some of these traditional PAM tools in that new environment in the way in which they wanted to operate, so to speak, right? Could you
My
make
answer is definitively no, Matt. That sounds radically crazy because you would have to go out of your way to devolve what AWS is to retrofit it to what you have in a traditional PAM sense. Here's another way to put it. Somebody prove me wrong. Anybody listening, please write into this webinar. We'll meet in person. I'll buy you a drink, dinner, whatever. Can you create a service account that's overprivileged that uses a proxy similar to the diagrams we had? That's how all traditional PAM tools worked. They give you a secondary account that has a static overprivileged access, and they manage it. That is not a functional capability in AWS unless you go way out of your way to do it. So, no, I mean, that's why a lot of folks struggle specifically in AWS. Azure, they recognize this and they said, Microsoft said, whoa, whoa, that's scary. Let's give the people what they know. Let's give them AD in Azure and call it Entra. And then we can manage their resource, or we can manage their Active Directory groups this way. Then they got to resources and they're like, wait a minute, we got to do something else. Let's do service principles, radically different. GCP, all these other cloud tools kind of followed, in my opinion, AWS's lead and said, hey, we don't have to confine ourselves to the constructs of how traditional identity worked with these overprivileged static service accounts. Maybe there's a better way. So no, you can't just do it in AWS.
and I want to go back to something you said there about, so you said role assumption. Can you explain that a little bit more to me? And then like how does that make that different from the traditional, like what you were saying? Like I'm used to a login, password, passkey, hardware key, whatever, but I'm logging in directly to stuff. What is role assumption?
Yeah, I was using this example the other day. We have a new intern here, and we were kind of chatting about identity. And I was explaining to him, hey man, I got a landscaper who comes to my house and he takes care of stuff. And I got a lock on my gate. And just because I give him the key doesn't mean he can come in my house and do whatever he wants, right? That's traditional PAM. That's identity centric. He's the landscaper. He has a job to do. He needs a key to come in. Where AWS is different, where role assumption is different to me is this example. I have a water hose in my yard that needs to be used to water my grass. It's a resource. When the landscaper needs it, he gets the water hose and uses it. He doesn't have the water hose 24/7 with the water turned on. So AWS look at things, in my opinion, more from a resource level. Here are the resources I have. Why should I give them to you? Versus, here's who I am. I got super badge and super key. I need everything. So it's kind of a different approach to the world.
Gotcha. So in your example too, there's nothing saying that maybe I could come over to your house and use the hose. Like I could just assume that role if you had given me permissions to do that because you said,
Yeah.
hey, I'm going to be out of town. I trust you, Matt. Here's the key code to my
Yeah, I
gate.
don't got to go create a
Like,
new key just for Matt and all this madness and worry about where it's at. Matt, you want it? All right, you're on the list, buddy. You can come. The hose knows you. Yeah.
gotcha. No, that makes a lot of sense. So I guess there's another thing that I keep thinking of too. I mean, the other big difference is we were showing corporate networks and firewalls and everything felt very safe, if not complicated. I remember what a pain it was to get some of the access that I needed at that job where I was trying to call, not just calling out to those servers, but those servers actually needed to come back. It was actually an
Yeah.
Oracle database they had to fetch stuff out of. And you had to go through IT and get all that. The nice thing about the cloud is that that kind of went away, right? I can do what I want. I can go directly to the cloud, but maybe that's also a little different or a little scary because it's just kind of out there, right?
Right. And it is its own little environment. That's the power of it. Everything's done there. Everything's done fast. And if I'm constantly waiting on you in this diagram, man, to bring me some sort of credentials you manage inside, I have no relevant, purview into, that slows me down. Especially if I'm a function, right? If I'm a task, if I'm a service principal, not a service account. like a Lambda function. If I do things where I just need something right now, why do I got to wait for you, the human being, to bring me this from your vault on premise? What a nightmare. Why? Why can't I just have it inside my own little cloud, Matt?
That's true. Well, and if you're in the cloud, I mean, looking at this diagram here, how do you get to that vault? It doesn't look like you could unless you gave the cloud access to your corporate network.
You see, right? I giggle because that's the exact nightmare. Now you're saying, hey, cloud, you want stuff? You got to come through all that heavy lifting. Remember our next gen firewall, WAFs, CASBs, blah, 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 to get what you want from me now, cloud? That's a headache. That's a
Sounds kind of
headache,
risky
Matt.
too,
It's
letting the
dangerous.
public
Yeah,
cloud
because,
open.
yeah, woo, that's dangerous. So, yeah. What we're highlighting here, I think, is that key that although it's a silo, it's not a bad thing. There are ways to communicate better, but it doesn't fit the old world. Trying to go back is where you run into trouble.
Well, I think back in the day too, when you said cloud, at least initially, it was like, okay, it's this thing that AWS has come out with. So we're the cloud, but then everybody kind of started talking about being like, oh, we're cloud applications. I think to this day, Salesforce, you look at them, their logo is a cloud. They call themselves a cloud platform.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this isn't just infrastructure, right? Like this is actually anything that's a SaaS, PaaS, IaaS,
Yeah.
DaaS, like asterisk AAS kind of thing, right? I mean, like, isn't that all just kind of the cloud? It's anything outside your own network effectively these days.
Yeah, and yeah, to your point, right? I like that. Even clouds themselves, in the beginning, when I started doing this not that long ago, 4 years ago, I used to focus on cloud service providers first, meaning, the big guys, AWS, Azure, GCP, and then SaaS was evolving, DaaS was evolving, PaaS was evolving, just the basically of saying it's not hosted by you and we're using our own services to accomplish a task. Yeah, that increases the landscape dramatically of what's needed. And if you're trying to keep these things vaulted this way in a PAM tool, and the IAM constructs of each of those is radically different as well. Keep in mind, can you give it an overprivileged static service account that your traditional PAM tool is going to use? Probably not. They're not looking at the world that way anymore. You're going to have a hard time.
Interesting. So now I think it's time to go a little bit deeper. We've already touched on some of these reasons why the cloud is different, but there is a thing that I've heard a lot since I've gotten here: NHIs, non-human identities. Now, I think we've called these different things over the years. You call them automations, you call them service accounts, you call them whatever. But fundamentally, I think this is something I want to understand a little bit more. Is this key to understanding why the cloud is so different?
Dramatically. Yeah, dramatically why it's different. Again, I keep harping on service accounts that are overprivileged statically. This is what we're kind of alluding to. I personally like non-person entities. That was coined by the DoD. All their zero trust write-ups highlight it. This is kind of a vendor thing, non-human identities. Kudos to whoever created that. But at the end of the day, they're basically saying you are not a human being doing something, in my opinion. You are either an automated task, an automated function, even an AI probably is operated by non-human identities accessing the data sets that it's accessing. These are, different.
So why are these so important in the cloud? I mean, back in even in the kind of the old server world, you had scripts and automations and things like that that would handle some of the stuff.
Yeah, they're important because, like in the case of AWS, for example, I picked on Lambda. It's kind of like a trusted employee of AWS land, right? Hey, I trust you, Lambda. You're a function that does exactly what I need you to do. That picture of a robot's beautiful. You have access to all the resources. You understand all my constructs. You live in my world. I trust you. So that's basically when I talk about non-human identities, non-person entities. That's what they're doing. They're doing functions within their ecosystem where they're designed to live there, move fast, do things in the right way.
Gotcha. That makes sense. And so it looks like, if I'm understanding this correctly too, there's a good chance, like you said, they're trusted. So the AWS robots don't just magically get to go wherever they want. It's not like I can transition those to another environment without probably a lot of very specific setup. But at the
Right.
same
It's like
time,
a,
that makes
yeah.
them, it's hard to externalize those, right? Like I got to work within AWS or Snowflake here to
Yep.
work with those.
It's like a fish out of water, right? Like, the Lambda function, you try to execute them in GCPs. I don't even know where I'm at. to die, right? So yeah, they're designed to operate within the constructs of their world to effectively do it in a better, faster way, right? So they do exist in a lot of these environments, and they do their job and they're really good at it. And that's where again, these traditional PAM tools that we're relying on, like a directory, Active Directory, or some directory to create a user account that they had access over. They don't understand these constructs. They don't operate in the same functional way. Although they may manage something like a vault, some of these robots might be able to fetch passwords or your point encryption keys, PEM files, things like that. They cannot manage the robot. They don't think that way.
Think that way. So one thing that this makes me think of is all of the, I mean, the cloud development, that's just kind of an expectation these days. People are, I say they're cloud first, they're cloud forward, and all the things that come along with it, like DevOps and cloud ops, continuous integration and deployment. I'm thinking of like, so I worked at GitLab for 3.5 years. If you're not familiar, it's like GitHub, basically, but it is a DevOps platform. And so I got really close to a lot of this stuff. But one of the things that I realized is there's a lot of very sensitive information that goes into these automations. You've got, you know, there's access tokens or security certs, or, worst case, you put password in there. So there's all this trust that's placed in these tool sets to get into the cloud environments to set up things. But at the same time, it moves so fast, right? Like I might spin
Yeah.
up an environment, deploy my code, realize I need to change something. I tear the whole environment down, and this could be, hours or minutes. And if I think back to what we were talking about in the old world, you didn't throw your server away and start over. You just recompiled your application, and worst case, you re-image it, but it was with a gold master image that everything else was
Yeah.
patterned off of. So if I had to oversimplify it, it feels like the left is static and fairly well defined, but the right side is, it moves so fast and it's so ephemeral. I don't know how you'd even map that.
Yeah, that's the value, man. So it's give and take, right? So the left-hand side, you have a ton of control, right? And things are good. I used to watch this show, I'm older than I look, called Malcolm in the Middle. And one of the kids on there tells this guy, he's like, the future is now, old man. And I always thought it was funny, but now I'm the old man. What that means is if you're not able to adapt and be agile as a business, what are you doing? You're probably destined to fail. So adopting the cloud and technologies like it are right now. Tools like Kubernetes, things like in the cloud. And to your point exactly, because the risk is worth the reward, time to value, total cost of ownership, to your point, automation, all these things fit. It's not to say that we shouldn't try to protect it. We absolutely should. But rather than try to retrofit this PAM solution that everyone knew, service accounts that are overprivileged, statically defined, forced through this video session recording, the future is now, right? So we have to adapt. So kudos to tools like Wiz that have come out and highlighted blinking red lights. Here's what we think you should do because these things move so fast. Here's how you can do it. This is where a lot of traditional PAM, practitioners are struggling because a lot of these concepts are so new. Wiz is trying to tell them, hey, this function is overprivileged, or you can do this thing ephemerally. That's where we need the help, right?
It's where you need help. And I can imagine too, part of what they would point out is you have an environment that didn't exist 10 seconds ago,
Yeah,
right? Like,
literally. Yeah, it was spun up and down in under a minute sometimes. What are you gonna spin up a whole new PAM VM to connect to that 1 minute environment? So exactly.
wouldn't even have time to map it over, it seems like. Okay,
No, yeah, it's not possible.
gotcha. Well, I guess it's time to talk a little then about, like, so what can we do about this? Right. So we have talked a lot about where traditional PAM tools started. They had a very clear need and use case for the on-prem world. Doesn't sound like they apply in the cloud. What are, I guess, in your opinion, let's start at the beginning there, or the beginning of the need. What are some of the key things that a modern, like, for the cloud PAM tool needs to address, like at a bare minimum?
Yeah. At a bare minimum, I like to keep it simple, and I've been saying this a lot, right? Because the world is going to go faster than we can expect, you should anticipate that and find a way to unify it. some sort of standardized way of managing access to these new worlds, and we'll call them clouds, right? How do you unify how you're managing all these? Also, you got to keep it simple. If you're going to try to spin up a virtual machine and do video session recording for every one of these activities, and oh my goodness, have fun. But if you don't keep it simple, by the time you develop whatever you're trying to build, that technology may have already evolved and died, right? So keep it simple. And the last piece is secure it. What are we ultimately trying to do at the end of the day? We're ultimately trying to secure these environments. We're trying to make sure these actors that are doing things, whether they're humans, whether they're non-human identities, processes, or functions, have only the access they need when they need it, whether that's a group, a role, or a privilege. We absolutely want to keep focusing on credentials. Maybe there's a better way, like workload federation, some trust relationships, right? That space will continue to evolve. But, let's focus on the things we can, unifying this world, simplifying it, and securing it as best as possible.
That is great advice. Now, what about for the teams themselves? So I kind of get, again, in the old world, as a software engineer, I probably didn't have to use my, say my root access all that often. But in this, you know, CI/CD world, I might be checking in multiple things per hour potentially.
Mm.
And I know I'm not the ones pulling those levers, but I've got all these tools that are set up to do all these things for me. What should I be
Yeah.
looking at from from an organizational perspective?
Yeah, from an organizational perspective, always keep in mind that everybody has a job to do, right? And how do we do it to the best of our capacity means understanding the business value of what we're doing. Why do I say that? Traditionally, PAM was an organization as an entity or a tool is a big, big no. You cannot have XYZ. My recommendation would be to focus on guardrails. In a very fast-paced moving world where we want people to continue to do what they're doing in different teams, business units, can we provide the guardrails of what is acceptable around access management? Specifically, and more importantly, on privileged access management. What I mean by that is access to prod. So rather than giving them and forcing a tool down their throat and saying you must use this, let's provide them with guardrails and find tools that are adaptable to our own guidelines in that perspective, right? How do we meet them where they live? Because they drive revenue.
That sounds very sensible. At the same time, security, there's still going to be compliance needs. Like those aren't going away, right? So we've got
Right.
a few things up here. We've talked about least privilege, right? Don't give me more
Mhm.
access than I need. But then what about what is the zero standing privileges
This is
and the
my
zero
favorite
trust
part, right?
authorization?
I
Where do
used to
these
work.
come in?
I used to work in a company called Oppenheimer Funds. We were in finance, so we were audited regularly. I had KPMG auditors that used to sit in my cubicle, five of them. They were in their early 20s. They used to ask me all sorts of questions. And mainly they revolved around audit. What we would do is a snapshot point in time of a system and what it looks like. So let's pick on my Active Directory example. They would say, let's pull up Active Directory, let's look at the domain admins group, and let's look at who's in it. We'd find people. Why is Matt Wilson in the domain admins group, John? And I would say, well, he just needs it to do his job. And they would say, okay, as long as somebody signs off on that, that's acceptable. Now, what's interesting is it doesn't have to be that way. Zero standing privileges means when you go to do an audit and you do a snapshot of that domain admins group, there's nothing in it. There's no user in it. There's nothing in it. It's empty. That group is only populated at the point in time, just in time when it's needed for as long as it's needed. There does not need to be static 24/7 access to something like a domain admins group. That's what zero standing privileges alludes to. You get the privileges you need, human, non-human, when you need them, for as long as you need them, and everything about that is controlled.
Interesting. So if I were to think from a just a security and a risk perspective, that would be a lot better potentially. You correct me if I'm wrong on this one, but if there is no privileges associated with that identity, if something were to happen like I don't know, I lost my username and password, somebody picked it up, or there was a credentials breach, that account wouldn't have that high risk ability to do anything potentially. Like I've got to do some other mechanism, I'm assuming, to get my privileges when I want to do my domain admin thing.
My favorite is, even in that same vein, we forgot to deprovision a contractor's account. They have the login credentials. I am freaking out. If they don't have privilege in that group, if they have to request it, if they have to get it in a different way, the risk is reduced dramatically from 24/7 risk exposure to only when potentially they're using it with a ton of controls in place. Correct.
Gotcha. So then how does that feed into that last point there, the zero trust authorization piece? Explain a little bit more about that.
That's my favorite, man. I should like contact the DoD and ask him to buy me, like, I think they got a $25 limit on lunch, buy me lunch. Anyways, DoD, Department of Defense, has this whole write up on zero trust, and not the catchy acronyms and abuse of, oh, our tool zero trust. It's a concept, right? Part of that concept is when you have non-person entities and humans, there are two critical controls. There's an authentication control and an authorization control. Authentication is what we talked about: credentials, passwords, blood samples. I'm going to take your eyeball, whatever they want. Authentication, you prove who you are, you say you are. Authorization is the other piece. What do you need access to? Resource, data, groups, roles, permissions. Those are two different authorization points. Everyone understands pretty well the authentication authorization point. I'm going to challenge you with an MFA step up. Can you give me the MFA? The other piece, though, authorization decision point, is a lot less understood, which we're trying to help educate. That's where we're saying, what privileges should you have? How should you have it? How long should you have it for? So it is actually functionally assigning that privilege to your account.
Okay, so that sounds like zero standing privileges not only feeds into that, it's almost kind of a requirement for zero trust because I
That's
have
the
to
ultimate
reprove
evolution.
every time to give it back.
That's the ultimate evolution. And maybe not you as a human, maybe there's automated ways to do it, but the key is there's nothing to steal if somebody stole your credentials.
Interesting. That's almost a little hard still to wrap my brain around because I'm so, again, that old school way. You had a username and a password. That was my authentication, but it also was my authorization. Once I got in with those credentials, I could do whatever they told me I could do, right?
To your point, in the AD way, that's because I put you in the groups that gave you that access. So I'm not giving you those access statically by default. I'm giving them to you when you need them.
Fantastic. Well, we are about out of time here, so we'll kind of skip to the end. I know, John, we had some points about maturity from a PAM perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we've talked through a lot of these. This is kind of where we started. And it sounds like if we were going to say, I'm starting from like baseline nothing today. This is kind of like maybe basic functionality. It's not necessarily what you need for the cloud, but it's a start. Is that fair?
That's fair. For anyone to pass the most fundamental audit and get sponsored by insurance for having a PAM, you do these things, you're going to pass. Are
You're
you
going to
safe?
pass.
Questionable. Will you pass audit? Yes.
So then as we move up into the right here, obviously we're adding on more and more capabilities and features. In your opinion, looking at this, I got to imagine no tool is going to do all these things, right? There's going to be things that you'll have to look for, compromise potentially, but where is the best place to go if I don't have anything today, especially from that cloud side? Where should I target? Basic, advanced, and what are the sort of like must-have non-negotiables for a modern tool?
Yeah, you can. I would recommend folks, especially if they have cloud, intermediate step one, just in time. Here's why. Every cloud is designed to work this way. Every cloud is designed with APIs in mind of how they're going to function, where you can start to say, I can control just in time the access to the privilege, because in the cloud world, there are APIs. This can be also done on premise, make no mistake. But if you're just stepping into this, you're baby stepping out of basic, and you're tired of just saying you're compliant, you want real security, start looking at the intermediate just in time access, right? Um, Next up would be a lot of the automation around that, right? App to app. This is something else too. Like, again, a provision service account's not going to work. Can we look at workload federation? Can we trust each other between, for example, clouds? They trust each other. We have some brokering there of even credentials, whatever they call secrets, right? So in the intermediate, those two are great places to start. Just in time, give somebody what they want when they want it and take it away. And then app to app, workload federation.
Fantastic. And it seems like ultimately, I would guess you really want to get up and to the right, like zero trust, zero standing privileges. Is that kind of top of the mountain?
Yep. So up and to the right. So here's the other thing about intermediate I should have doubled down on is just focus on prod too. You can justify spend when you're
Good point.
protecting prod. The big thing about up and to the right is I'm not differentiating between production environments and dev environments anymore. On the most advanced side, we're saying our entire ecosystem, all the way through. Lower environments, upper environments all have this concept of zero standing privileges. Everything is managed by both authentication decision points and authorization decision points, and everything's done where possible automatically as part of a build process. So that is the difference there is, the scope of it. We're not talking about 5 admins in the basic model. We're talking about every user ever to secure the entire org.
That's a great point because you would certainly hate to get popped because somebody had a secret or an access key in a non-production environment that was copied from the production environment accidentally because it's
Exactly.
still in that same
Like,
public cloud. It's just in a
we
different
accidentally
spot.
put it in that repo. I didn't mean to. The robot did it. I saw Matt Wilson's
Somebody did
drawing. A
it.
robot put it there. It wasn't me.
That's right. Well, fantastic. John, this is, as always, this has been a great conversation. I know we've gone a little over the 45-minute time there, but I guess we'll give folks a couple minutes to see if there were any questions that come in. And if not, I think we'll go ahead and wrap up and say thank you, everyone. While we wait on those questions, any parting thoughts that you've got, John? Any salient advice you would say to somebody that's looking at this for the first time and going, I don't even know where to start.
Just that comment that every year identity is becoming more and more important because everyone's realizing it's not just an operational function. PAM is a subset of that, right? It can extend beyond that. We don't need to relegate it there just to satisfy compliance and audit. If you're trying to do real security, look at access management holistically and how you can improve your whole program. You don't have to be relegated to some vendor telling you what needs to be done. Use my virtual machine jump server with these static overprivileged service accounts. The world is new, and if you evolve with it, it'll be a better place.